They said his gate didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic, demanded he tear it down immediately, threatened fines, liens, even foreclosure if he didn't comply. The HOA board stood on his doorstep with clipboards and smug expressions, pointing at the wrought iron barrier like it was some kind of eyesore. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't just any gate, and this wasn't just any homeowner. Behind that modest smile and polite nods, David Chun was about to teach them a lesson about property law that would cost them everything. Because when the dust settled, they wouldn't just need his permission to use his gate. They'd need his permission to access their own street. The same people who demanded conformity were about to discover what happens when you push someone who actually reads the fine print. The violation notice in his hand carried a 48-hour deadline, $500 per day and fines after that. Remove the gate or face foreclosure. It should have been simple intimidation, the kind that worked on every other resident in Willowbrook Estates. But as Karen Mitchell walked away from his door with her clipboard and confident stride, she had no idea that David Chun had spent 30 years reading property surveys for the county. And buried in those decades-old documents was a secret that would flip their entire power structure upside down. By Monday morning, the HOA would be begging him for access to their own neighborhood. The same gate they wanted demolished would become the only thing standing between 300 families and their homes. Because sometimes the quiet guy who follows all the rules is the most dangerous person to cross. And sometimes property law has a sense of humor that's absolutely perfect. Welcome to Heartland Tales. Before we dive into this incredible tale of neighborhood justice, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of our community. Willowbrook Estates looked like every other suburban development built in the last decade. Cookie-cutter houses with manicured lawns, identical driveways, and enough beige siding to make a paint manufacturer rich. The kind of neighborhood where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. Every mailbox the same height, every fence the same color, every tree trimmed to the same unnatural perfection. It was the American dream standardized, sanitized, and sold to families who wanted safety, security, and the comfort of knowing their neighbors would never do anything unexpected. The Homeowners Association ruled this domain with an iron fist wrapped in legal documents. Monthly meetings in the community center where violations were discussed like criminal offenses. Architectural review committees that scrutinized every flower bed, every porch light, every attempt at individual expression. The covenant document was 37 pages long, covering everything from acceptable paint colors to the maximum height of garden decorations. Residents learned quickly that it was easier to comply than to fight. Pay your dues, follow the rules, and life would be peaceful. Challenge the system, and you'd discover just how creative HOA boards could get with fines and restrictions. Karen Mitchell had been HOA president for 8 years, ever since retiring from her job as a middle school principal. She approached Homeowners Association management with the same authoritarian efficiency she'd once used to discipline teenagers. Regular neighborhood patrols with her digital camera, documenting every violation. Board meetings where she'd present her findings like a prosecutor laying out evidence. She had the kind of smile that never reached her eyes and the ability to make routine conversations feel like disciplinary hearings. Most residents feared her. A few respected her dedication to maintaining property values. None of them particularly liked her, but they all understood that crossing Karen Mitchell was a mistake that would cost them money, time, and peace of mind. She had the HOA bylaws memorized, a network of neighbors who reported violations, and enough free time to make someone's life miserable if they challenged her authority. David Chun had moved to Willowbrook 6 months earlier, a quiet man in his 50s who worked as a surveyor for the county. He'd bought the corner lot at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story house with a small front yard and a driveway that curved around to meet the main road. The location was perfect for someone who valued privacy. Trees on 2 sides, a clear view of anyone approaching, and enough distance from the nearest neighbor to avoid the casual conversations that suburban life seemed to demand. He'd been polite during the move-in process, waved at the neighbors, attended one HOA meeting, introduced himself with the kind of reserved friendliness that suggested he wanted to be left alone. The board members had seemed pleased with their new resident. Paid his dues on time, kept his lawn trimmed, asked no questions about the covenant document. He seemed like the ideal neighbor. Quiet, compliant, and unlikely to cause trouble. His daily routine was predictable. Leave for work at 6:30 in the morning, return by 5 in the afternoon. Weekends spent maintaining his property, reading on his back porch, or working in his small garden. He drove a practical sedan, dressed in plain clothes, and gave no indication that he was anything more than another middle-aged man who'd chosen suburban comfort over urban excitement. The neighbors gradually stopped paying attention to him. No loud parties, no unusual visitors, no violations to report. He blended into the background of Willowbrook life, becoming just another face in the subdivision directory. Even Karen Mitchell seemed to forget about him, focusing her attention on more problematic residents. The family with the unauthorized bird feeder. The couple who'd painted their shutters the wrong shade of green. The teenager who kept parking his motorcycle in the driveway instead of the garage. Then came the gate. David had installed it himself over a weekend in early spring. Nothing elaborate, just a simple wrought iron design that matched the Victorian-style lampposts the HOA had approved for the development. It stood 6 feet tall, painted black with decorative scrollwork near the top. 2 panels that swung open to allow cars through, with a matching pedestrian gate beside it. The whole thing looked professional, tasteful, and completely in line with the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. He'd researched the specifications carefully before ordering the materials, checked the covenant document for height restrictions, color requirements, and approved materials. Ironwork was explicitly permitted. Earth tone colors were mandatory. 6 feet was the maximum height for any barrier structure. Everything about his gate complied with the written guidelines. The installation took him most of Saturday. He'd marked the property lines carefully, using his professional surveying equipment to ensure the posts were positioned correctly. The gate aligned perfectly with his driveway, creating a clear boundary between his property and the street. It opened smoothly, closed securely, and looked like it had been there since the neighborhood was built. Several neighbors stopped by to admire his work. Compliments about the craftsmanship, questions about where he'd purchased the materials, friendly conversation about property security. No one mentioned any concerns about HOA approval. No one suggested he might be violating any regulations. The gate seemed to fit seamlessly into the neighborhood's aesthetic. By Sunday evening, David was satisfied with his work. The gate provided the privacy he'd wanted without creating an eyesore. It was functional, attractive, and legally compliant. He'd followed every rule, met every specification, and created something that enhanced rather than detracted from the neighborhood's appearance. He had no idea that Karen Mitchell had been photographing his work from across the street. The first complaint came on a Monday morning. Karen stood at his door with a manila folder thick with photocopied regulations. She was dressed in her usual neighborhood patrol outfit, sensible shoes, khaki pants, and a polo shirt with the Willowbrook Estates logo embroidered above the pocket. Her expression was stern but controlled, the look of someone who'd delivered this speech many times before. "Mr. Chun," she said, consulting her clipboard like she was reading from a script. "I'm afraid we have a problem with your recent installation." David had been watering his front garden, still in his work clothes from the night shift. He set down the hose and walked over, hands still damp from the sprinkler. He'd been expecting this conversation, not because he'd violated any rules, but because he'd learned enough about Karen Mitchell to know she enjoyed exercising her authority. "What kind of problem?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Karen opened the folder and pulled out a color photograph of his gate, taken from multiple angles. Professional quality images that showed every detail of the installation. The Architectural Review Committee met last night. This structure wasn't approved through the proper channels. "I followed the guidelines," David said calmly. "Ironwork, 6 feet maximum height, earth tone colors. Everything's in compliance with the covenant. The guidelines require pre-approval for any permanent structures." Karen's voice had the practiced patience of someone who delivered this speech before. Section 12, Paragraph 4. No exceptions. The gate needs to come down immediately. David studied the papers she handed him. Dense paragraphs of legal language about architectural harmony, community standards, and unanimous approval requirements. The kind of bureaucratic maze designed to discourage residents from even trying to modify their property. But buried in the fine print was something Karen had missed. Something that would matter more than she realized. The pre-approval requirement was clearly stated. Any permanent structure visible from the street needed Architectural Review Committee approval before installation. But the definition of permanent structure was more complex than Karen had explained. It specifically excluded structures that were part of original property boundaries, historical installations, or modifications that restored property to its original platted configuration. "I'll need to review these documents," David said. "Give me a few days." "You have 48 hours, Karen replied. "After that, the fines begin. $500 per day until the violation is corrected." She walked away with the confident stride of someone who'd never been challenged. Behind her, David stood in his driveway, still holding the violation notice. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He'd dealt with bureaucracy his entire career. He knew how these people operated. They relied on intimidation, on the assumption that homeowners would rather pay than fight. What they didn't understand was that David Chun had spent 30 years reading property maps, land surveys, and legal descriptions. He knew exactly what he owned. And more importantly, he knew what everyone else thought they owned. The next morning, David drove to the county courthouse. Not to pay the fine, not to file an appeal, but to request copies of the original land survey for Willowbrook Estates. The clerk behind the counter recognized him from work, handed him the documents without question. Standard procedure for someone in his position. County surveyors had access to all recorded plat maps, deed restrictions, and boundary surveys. David spread the documents across his kitchen table that afternoon, comparing the official boundaries with the subdivision plat map the HOA had provided to residents. The developer's map showed clean property lines, standard lot sizes, and clearly marked common areas. The county survey revealed something far more interesting. It took him 3 hours to find what he was looking for. A small discrepancy in the property lines. A narrow strip of land that the developers had assumed belonged to the city, but which the county records showed as privately owned. The strip ran along the main road, connecting to the corner of David's lot. It was only 10 feet wide, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. But it was positioned in exactly the right place to control access to the entire neighborhood. David pulled out his calculator and began measuring distances. The strip of land extended from his property line to the opposite side of the road, cutting across the entrance to Willowbrook Estates. According to the survey, the city had granted an easement for public access decades ago, but the underlying ownership had never been transferred. The land still belonged to the original property owner, a farmer named William Hartwell who'd sold to the developers in 1987. A quick search through the county records revealed that William Hartwell had died in 2003. His estate had been probated, his assets distributed. But this narrow strip of land had been overlooked, forgotten in the shuffle of legal documents and family disputes. It had remained in limbo for 20 years, technically owned by the Hartwell estate, but abandoned and used and forgotten. Until now. David made a phone call to the county assessor's office, then to the State Department of Unclaimed Property. By Thursday afternoon, he had the paperwork he needed. The strip of land was officially classified as abandoned property, available for purchase through a quiet title action. The process would take 60 days, cost less than $3,000 in legal fees, and give him complete ownership of the access road to Willowbrook Estates. But David had a better idea, something that would resolve the gate dispute permanently while teaching Karen Mitchell a lesson she'd never forget. Karen returned on Friday morning, right on schedule. This time she brought backup 3 other board members, all carrying clipboards and wearing expressions that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. David recognized the tactic. Intimidation through numbers, the assumption that a single homeowner would be overwhelmed by official-looking people with official-sounding titles. "Mr. Chun," Karen announced, "your 48 hours are up. We're here to supervise the removal of your unauthorized structure." David was waiting for them with his own clipboard, a single sheet of paper that would change everything. "Actually, I have some information that might interest you." He handed Karen a copy of the original property survey, highlighting the narrow strip of land that controlled access to the neighborhood. According to county records, this development was built on land that's still privately owned. The access road crosses property that was never properly transferred to the city. Karen glanced at the document, clearly confused. "I don't understand what this has to do with your gate violation." "The gate isn't on my property," David said calmly. "It's on the Hartwell estate." which means the Architectural Review Committee has no jurisdiction over it. The board members exchanged uncertain looks. This wasn't the conversation they'd expected. Karen studied the survey more carefully, her confidence beginning to waver. Even if that's true, you still installed a structure without permission. Permission from whom? David asked. The Hartwell estate? They've been dead for 20 years. The city? They only have an easement for public access. The HOA? They have no legal authority over property they don't own. Karen's face was beginning to flush. This is ridiculous. You can't just ignore HOA regulations because of some technicality. It's not a technicality, David said. It's property law. And since I've been in contact with the state about purchasing this abandoned property, I thought you should know that the access easement expires in 30 days. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Karen stared at the survey, trying to process what she was hearing. The other board members looked like they wanted to disappear. Finally, Karen found her voice. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that in 30 days, the public access easement to Willowbrook Estates will expire. The property will revert to private ownership, and the new owner will have the right to control access to the neighborhood. Karen's face went pale. You can't be serious. I'm very serious. And I'm also reasonable. I'd be happy to negotiate a new access agreement with the HOA. Something that benefits everyone involved. The board members began whispering among themselves. Karen stood frozen, still holding the survey document like it might explode. David waited patiently, knowing that the implications were slowly sinking in. What kind of agreement? Karen asked finally. Simple. The HOA drops all violations related to my gate. In exchange, I'll grant a permanent easement for neighborhood access. Everyone wins. Karen looked at her fellow board members, searching for support. They offered none. The reality of the situation was becoming clear. David Chen wasn't just another homeowner to intimidate. He was someone who understood the law better than they did. And he held all the cards. We'll need to consult with our attorney, Karen said weakly. Of course. But remember, you have 30 days. After that, the easement expires and access to the neighborhood becomes a private matter. David turned and walked back toward his house, leaving the board members standing in his driveway. Karen clutched the survey document, her hands shaking slightly. The other board members looked like they'd just witnessed a car accident. Within an hour, Karen was on the phone with the HOA's attorney. The conversation lasted 20 minutes and ended with Karen hanging up, her face ashen. The lawyer had confirmed David's research. The access easement was indeed expiring. The property had never been properly transferred, and David Chun had every legal right to purchase it and control access to the neighborhood. An emergency board meeting was called for that evening. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. 300 families suddenly faced the possibility of losing access to their own homes. Property values would collapse overnight. The entire subdivision would become worthless. Karen Mitchell stood at the front of the crowded community center, looking like she'd aged 10 years in a single day. Residents filled every chair, lined the walls, and spilled into the hallway. The room buzzed with angry voices, demanding explanations, threatening lawsuits. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen began, her voice barely audible above the crowd noise. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. She explained the property dispute, the expiring easement, and David Chen's ultimatum. The room erupted in chaos. Residents shouted questions, accusations, and demands for action. Karen stood helplessly at the podium, overwhelmed by the crowd's anger. What do you want us to do? Someone yelled from the back of the room. We need to negotiate, Karen said. Mr. Chun has offered to grant a permanent easement in exchange for dropping the gate violation. So drop it, another voice called out. It's not that simple, Karen replied. If we give in to this demand, it sets a precedent. Other residents might think they can ignore HOA regulations. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Residents didn't care about precedents or HOA authority. They cared about accessing their homes. Karen realized she was fighting a losing battle. We'll meet with Mr. Chin tomorrow, she announced. We'll try to reach an agreement. The meeting dissolved into smaller groups, neighbors discussing the situation in worried whispers. Karen packed her papers slowly, knowing that her authority as HOA president had just evaporated. She'd pushed the wrong person, and now everyone in the neighborhood would pay the price. The next morning, Karen Mitchell stood at David Chin's door for the third time in a week. This time, She came alone. No clipboard, no backup, no confidence. Just a tired woman who'd finally met someone who understood the game better than she did. Mr. Chun, she said quietly, I think we need to talk. David invited her inside, offered coffee, and sat across from her at his kitchen table. The same table where he'd discovered the property discrepancy that changed everything. Karen looked smaller somehow, deflated by the realization that her authority had limits. I've been HOA president for 8 years, she said. I've never encountered anything like this. I imagine not, David replied. Most people don't read the fine print. What do you want from us? David pulled out a simple one-page document. I want the gate violation dismissed. I want a written apology from the Architectural Review Committee. And I want a permanent easement agreement that protects neighborhood access. Karen read the document carefully. The terms were reasonable, almost generous. David could have demanded monthly fees, restricted access hours, or any number of punitive measures. Instead, he was offering exactly what he'd promised. A solution that benefited everyone. Why are you being so reasonable? Karen asked. Because I never wanted a fight, David said. I just wanted to install a gate on my property. You could have approved it and avoided all of this. Karen signed the document with a shaking hand. The gate violation was officially dismissed. The Architectural Review Committee would issue a formal apology, and David Chun would grant a permanent easement for neighborhood access, ensuring that 300 families could continue reaching their homes. Within a week, the legal paperwork was complete. David officially owned the narrow strip of land that controlled access to Willowbrook Estates. The easement was recorded with the county, protecting the neighborhood's rights in perpetuity. And Karen Mitchell quietly resigned as HOA president, citing health concerns. The gate remained exactly where David had installed it. Black wrought iron with decorative scrollwork, standing 6 feet tall at the entrance to his property. It opened smoothly for his car each morning and closed securely behind him each evening. The same gate that had caused so much trouble now stood as a symbol of what happened when bureaucracy met someone who actually understood the law. David Chun never spoke about the incident publicly. He didn't gloat about his victory or seek recognition for outmaneuvering the HOA. He simply went back to his quiet routine, maintaining his property, reading on his back porch, and working in his small garden. The neighbors treated him with a new kind of respect, the kind reserved for someone who'd proven they shouldn't be underestimated. The new HOA president was a younger woman named Sarah Martinez, a lawyer who'd learned from Karen Mitchell's mistakes. She instituted a new policy requiring legal review of all violation notices before they were issued. She also established a mediation process for disputes, ensuring that residents had a chance to explain their side before facing fines or other penalties. But most importantly, she made sure that every board member understood the limits of their authority. The HOA could enforce neighborhood standards, but they couldn't ignore property law. They could require compliance with architectural guidelines, but they had to follow their own procedures. And they could never again assume that a quiet homeowner would simply accept intimidation without fighting back. David's Gate still stands today, a testament to the power of knowledge, patience, and careful preparation. It reminds everyone in Willowbrook Estates that sometimes the most dangerous person to cross is the one who reads the fine print. And sometimes justice comes not from grand gestures or public confrontations, but from understanding exactly where you stand and exactly what you own. The lesson resonates far beyond one suburban neighborhood. In a world where authority figures often rely on intimidation and assumption, David Chun proved that knowledge is the greatest equalizer. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats, didn't resort to anger or confrontation. He simply read the documents, understood the law, and used that knowledge to protect his rights while finding a solution that worked for everyone. This story was brought to you by Heartland Tales. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who quietly stood up for what was right, even when it cost them something. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how they changed your perspective on standing up for yourself. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We'll see you in the next one.